The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village square as Elena Rodriguez adjusted her simple white dress in the cracked mirror of her childhood bedroom. Outside, she could hear the whispers and laughter of neighbors who had gathered not to celebrate, but to witness what they called the biggest mistake of her life. At 26, Elena was considered past her prime in the small coastal village of San Miguel, but that wasn't why the villagers mocked her. They ridiculed her choice of husband, a man they knew only as Marcus, the beggar who had appeared in their village 6 months ago, living in an abandoned shack by the beach and surviving on odd jobs and charity. Elena's mother wrung her hands nervously in the doorway, her face etched with worry and disappointment. "It's not too late," she pleaded for the 100th time. "Ricardo Gonzalez is still willing to marry you. His family owns 3 fishing boats. You would want for nothing." But Elena shook her head firmly. She had made her choice, and though she couldn't fully explain it to her family or anyone else, she knew in her heart that Marcus was different. There was something in his eyes, an intelligence, a kindness, a depth that belied his tattered clothes and humble circumstances. The ceremony took place in the village's small chapel, presided over by Father Miguel, who had agreed to perform the service despite pressure from prominent families to refuse. Only a handful of people attended: Elena's disapproving parents, her younger brother who looked embarrassed to be there, and Marcus's best man, an elderly vagrant named Thomas who had befriended him. The pews that should have been filled with well-wishers sat empty, a stark reminder of the village's judgment. As Elena walked down the aisle, she heard someone outside shout, "She's throwing her life away," followed by cruel laughter. Marcus stood at the altar in the only suit he owned, a threadbare gray ensemble that hung loosely on his lean frame. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved carefully that morning. When Elena reached him and looked into his warm brown eyes, she saw tears glistening there. "Are you sure?" he whispered, giving her one last chance to escape. She squeezed his hand and smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." As they exchanged vows, Elena noticed something she had observed before but never questioned. Marcus spoke with perfect diction, his words carefully chosen and eloquent, so unlike the rough speech of the other poor men in the village. After the brief ceremony, there was no reception, no celebration. The couple walked hand in hand through the village streets toward Marcus's shack, enduring stares and whispered comments. Old Mrs. Fuentes spat on the ground as they passed. Mr. Santos, the wealthiest merchant in town, shook his head in theatrical pity. "That girl had promise," he announced loudly to his companions. "She could read and write. Now she'll spend her life in poverty, probably pregnant within the year and begging for scraps like her husband." Elena felt Marcus's hand tighten around hers, but he kept walking with his head held high, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. What none of the villagers knew, what Elena herself didn't know, was that hidden in Marcus's pocket was a satellite phone, and waiting in a bank in Geneva was a fortune worth over $3 billion. Elena woke on her first morning as a married woman to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The shack Marcus called home was a single room with walls made of weathered wood and a roof that leaked in 3 places. There was a small camping stove in one corner, a mattress on the floor covered with clean but worn sheets, and a wooden crate that served as a table. Despite its poverty, the space was immaculately clean, and Elena noticed details that seemed out of place: a small shelf of books including volumes of philosophy and classical literature, and in the corner, a locked metal box that Marcus never discussed. Marcus was already awake, preparing breakfast on the camping stove. The smell of coffee filled the small space, and Elena was surprised to see he had managed to make eggs and toast. "I know it's not much," he said apologetically, gesturing to the humble meal. "But I promise I'll always take care of you, Elena. Somehow, I'll make a better life for us." She sat cross-legged on the mattress and accepted the plate gratefully. As they ate, she studied her new husband. There were so many contradictions about him. His hands were rough from manual labor, yet his fingernails were always clean. He dressed in rags, yet he carried himself with an inexplicable confidence. He lived in poverty, yet he seemed entirely unbothered by it, as if it were a temporary condition rather than a permanent state. The first week of marriage fell into a routine. Each morning, Marcus would leave before dawn to work at the docks, loading and unloading fishing boats for whatever small payment the captains would offer. Elena took in sewing work, mending clothes for the village women who would hand her their garments without meeting her eyes, treating her with the same disdain they showed her husband. In the evenings, they would sit on the beach and watch the sunset, talking for hours. Marcus told her stories of faraway places, descriptions so vivid and detailed that Elena sometimes wondered if he had actually been to these exotic locations. When she asked, he would smile mysteriously and say, "I've read about them." One afternoon, while Marcus was at work, Elena decided to clean their small home more thoroughly. As she swept behind the wooden crate, she discovered a loose floorboard. Curiosity overcame her, and she gently pried it up, discovering a hidden space beneath. Inside was a laptop computer, completely out of place in their impoverished dwelling. The device was sleek, expensive-looking, and clearly not something a beggar could afford. Elena's heart raced. Was her husband a thief? Had he stolen this? She carefully replaced the floorboard and said nothing when Marcus returned home that evening, but questions gnawed at her mind. Who was this man she had married? Despite her growing curiosity, life continued. The village's treatment of them grew worse rather than better. Children were instructed to throw stones at their shack. Merchants charged them higher prices for basic goods. When Elena's mother became ill, the village doctor refused to visit because Elena's new last name, whatever Marcus's surname actually was, as he had never fully explained his background, brought shame to the family. Elena nursed her mother herself, and Marcus showed unexpected knowledge of herbal remedies that actually helped. "Where did you learn this?" Elena asked as he prepared a poultice. Marcus hesitated before answering. "My grandmother taught me before." He trailed off, never finishing the sentence, leaving Elena with yet another mystery about the man who shared her bed but kept so many secrets locked away in the depths of his carefully guarded heart. It was a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the wedding when a sleek black Mercedes pulled into San Miguel, immediately attracting attention. Foreign cars were rare in the village, especially luxury vehicles that gleamed in the sunlight as if they had never touched a dusty road. The car parked in the square, and a man emerged wearing an impeccably tailored suit and Italian leather shoes. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He approached the first person he saw, young Diego, the baker's son, and asked, "I'm looking for Marcus Steele. Can you direct me to him?" Diego laughed mockingly. "Marcus? You mean the beggar? Why would someone like you want anything to do with him?" The stranger's expression remained neutral, but his eyes grew cold. "Please answer the question." Something in his tone made Diego straighten up and point toward the beach. "He lives in a shack down there. But I'm warning you, he's nobody. A vagrant who tricked some stupid girl into marrying him." The stranger thanked him curtly and walked toward the shore with purposeful strides, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the sand with each step. Elena was alone at the shack, hanging laundry on a makeshift clothesline, when she noticed the well-dressed man approaching. Her first instinct was fear. Debt collectors sometimes came looking for poor people in the village, though she couldn't imagine Marcus owing anyone money. The stranger stopped a respectful distance away and removed his sunglasses. "Mrs. Steele?" he asked. Elena froze. Nobody had called Marcus by a last name before. He was just Marcus the beggar to everyone in San Miguel. Yes," she answered uncertainly. "My name is James Crawford. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Steele Enterprises. I need to speak with your husband urgently." Before Elena could respond, Marcus appeared on the path from the village, his clothes dirty from a morning of loading fish crates. When he saw James, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders straightened, his casual shuffle became a confident stride, and the humble expression he typically wore vanished, replaced by something harder, more commanding. "James," he said, his voice carrying an authority Elena had never heard before. "I told you never to come here." James bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed absurd given Marcus's appearance. "I apologize, sir, but this couldn't wait." There's been a situation with the Tokyo merger. They're demanding the CEO's presence within 48 hours, or the deal collapses. That's $12 billion at stake. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet.
CEO?
Billions of dollars? She looked between her husband and this stranger, comprehension slowly dawning. Marcus turned to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of poverty or hardship, but fear of losing her trust. Elena, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus took a deep breath. My full name is Marcus Steele. I'm the founder and CEO of Steele Enterprises, one of the largest technology conglomerates in the world. The company is worth approximately $45 billion, and my personal net worth is around $3 billion. I came to this village 6 months ago, disguised as a beggar, because I wanted to escape my life and find something real. Then I met you, and I fell in love with you, and I couldn't tell you the truth because I was afraid you would only see the money, not me. Elena sank onto the sand, her mind reeling, as everything she thought she knew about her husband shattered like glass. That evening, the shack felt smaller than ever as the three of them, Elena, Marcus, and James, sat in tense silence. James had retrieved a briefcase from his car, and now papers were spread across the wooden crate that served as their table. Elena stared at documents bearing letterheads from international banks, legal firms, and corporations. Each one referenced Marcus Steele as owner, chairman, or primary shareholder. The numbers were incomprehensible: accounts with 8- and 9-figure balances, stock portfolios, real estate holdings spanning 6 continents. Her husband, the man who had shared meals of rice and beans with her, apparently owned 3 private jets and a villa on the French Riviera. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, the weight of his deception clearly crushing him. I need to explain, he finally said. Elena nodded, unable to speak. Marcus began his story, his voice low and heavy with emotion. He had built his company from nothing, starting with a small software program he'd coded in college. Within 10 years, Steele Enterprises had become a tech giant, handling cybersecurity for governments and corporations worldwide. But success had come with a price. Everyone wanted something from me, he explained. Business partners wanted deals. Women wanted my money. Friends from before I was wealthy disappeared, replaced by sycophants and social climbers. I lost my brother to a kidnapping attempt. He survived, but he was never the same. I realized I was living in a golden cage, surrounded by people who saw Marcus Steele the billionaire, but no one saw me. 2 years ago, Marcus had suffered what his doctors called a nervous breakdown. The pressure, the constant security threats, the isolation, it had all become too much. After recovering, he made a radical decision. He would disappear for a year, leaving his company in the hands of his trusted executives, and live as an ordinary person. He wanted to experience genuine human connection, to know what it felt like to be valued for who he was rather than what he owned. I chose San Miguel because it was remote, because nobody here would recognize me, Marcus continued. I gave myself the ultimate test. Could I find happiness, friendship, maybe even love, when I had nothing to offer but myself? And then I met you, Elena. Elena remembered their first meeting. She had been at the market, and Marcus, then just a mysterious stranger in worn clothes, had helped her carry her groceries when her bag broke. They'd talked for hours that day. He'd made her laugh with his wit and impressed her with his insights about literature and philosophy. Over the following weeks, they continued meeting, and Elena found herself drawn to his kindness, his intelligence, his quiet strength. When he'd proposed 3 months later with a ring made from twisted copper wire he'd found on the beach, she'd said yes without hesitation, despite her family's horror and the village's condemnation. You loved me when you thought I was nobody, Marcus said, his voice breaking. You married me knowing it would make you a pariah. You chose me when I had nothing. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious? But Elena wasn't sure how she felt. Yes, she had loved Marcus the beggar, but had that Marcus been real? Or was he a performance, a character her billionaire husband had played? You lied to me, she said quietly. Every day, you let me worry about money for food, you let me see my mother sick without proper medical care, you let the village treat us like garbage, all while you could have ended it with a single phone call. You watched me struggle to mend clothes for pennies while you had billions in the bank. What kind of person does that? Marcus flinched, as if she'd struck him. Someone who was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if you knew the truth, everything would change. And I was right, wasn't I? Everything has changed. You're looking at me differently now. Elena stood up and walked to the door, staring out at the darkening ocean, trying to process the revelation that her entire marriage had been built on a fundamental lie, wondering if anything she believed about her husband and their life together was actually true. By the next morning, word had spread through San Miguel like wildfire. James Crawford, in his expensive suit and luxury car, had been impossible to miss, and the villagers' natural curiosity had turned to aggressive investigation. Someone had overheard fragments of the conversation on the beach. Others had seen the briefcase full of documents. Old Roberto, who cleaned the church, had heard Father Miguel on the phone with the Archbishop, excitedly reporting that one of his parishioners was secretly a billionaire. By sunrise, a crowd had gathered near the shack, kept at a respectful distance by James Crawford and 2 security personnel who had arrived overnight. Elena woke to find Marcus already awake, looking exhausted. He hadn't slept, she could tell. They know, he said simply, gesturing toward the window. Elena looked out and saw dozens of villagers standing in clusters, pointing and whispering. Among them she recognized faces. Mrs. Fuentes, who had spat at them on their wedding day, Mr. Santos the merchant, who had mocked her choice a husband, Ricardo Gonzalez, who had wanted to marry her for her domestic skills. Their expressions had changed from contempt to shock to something that looked uncomfortably like greed. What do we do? Elena asked. Marcus stood up, his transformation from beggar to billionaire now complete in his bearing, if not his clothing. We face them, he said. Together, if you'll stand with me. They walked out of the shack hand in hand, and the crowd immediately surged forward, stopped only by the security guards. Questions flew from every direction. Is it true you're rich? Why did you pretend to be poor? Are you going to help the village now? But the question that cut through all the others came from Mr. Santos, who pushed to the front with an obsequious smile that made Elena's stomach turn. Mr. Steele, he said, using the name with exaggerated respect, I've always known there was something special about you. I told my wife, I said, that Marcus is no ordinary beggar. Perhaps we could discuss some business opportunities? I have some land that would be perfect for development. Marcus's expression hardened. You told your wife that, did you? Because I distinctly remember you standing in front of your store 3 weeks ago, announcing loudly that my wife was throwing her life away by marrying a worthless vagrant. I remember you charging us double the normal price for rice and beans. I remember you laughing when children threw stones at our home. Mr. Santos's smile faltered. That was just... we didn't know. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice cold. You didn't know I had money, but that didn't give you the right to treat us with cruelty and contempt. Poverty doesn't make someone worthless. Your behavior revealed your character, not ours. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Marcus's gaze swept over them. He pointed to Mrs. Fuentes. You spat at my wife on our wedding day. To the baker. You refused to sell us bread, saying you didn't want beggar money touching your counter. To Ricardo Gonzalez, you told Elena's father she was an idiot for choosing me over you. One by one, Marcus cataloged their offenses, his memory for detail shocking them all. Then his expression softened slightly. But there were others who showed us kindness. Father Miguel, who married us despite pressure to refuse. Young Maria, who shared her lunch with me when I was working at the docks. Old Thomas, who had nothing himself but offered friendship. He paused. Those people revealed something important to me. That true character shows itself not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we treat those who can do nothing for us in return. Most of you failed that test spectacularly, and now that my circumstances have changed, you think you can simply erase your previous behavior with smiles and business proposals. But I won't forget, and neither will my wife. For 3 days, Elena refused to speak to Marcus beyond basic necessities. She moved out of the shack and returned to her parents' home, despite her father's sudden change of heart about the marriage. "Elena, darling," he'd said with an ingratiating smile, "I always knew there was something special about Marcus. You were wise to see it. Perhaps you and your husband would like to join us for dinner? I've invited the mayor and several prominent families. They're all eager to meet him properly." Elena had given her father a look of such withering contempt that he'd actually stepped back. "So now he's good enough?" she'd asked quietly. "Now that you know he has money, suddenly you support my marriage? Where were you when the village was mocking us? When Mother was sick and you forbade Marcus from helping because he was just a beggar?" She spent those days walking along the beach, trying to organize her thoughts. The revelation of Marcus's wealth had shattered her understanding of her own life. Every memory was now tainted with the knowledge of his deception. When they'd shared a single sweet roll because money was tight, had he been laughing at her internally? When she'd worried about paying for her mother's medicine, had he been testing her? The copper wire ring on her finger, which she'd worn with pride as a symbol of their love despite having no monetary value, now felt like a mockery. He could have bought her a diamond the size of a marble, but instead he'd given her twisted copper, watching her treasure it. Was that romantic or cruel? On the fourth day, James Crawford found her sitting on the rocks near the lighthouse. "May I speak with you, Mrs. Steele?" he asked. Elena nodded, and the older man sat down carefully, mindful of his expensive suit. "I've worked for your husband for 15 years, he began. "I've seen him negotiate deals with heads of state, manage thousands of employees, make decisions involving billions of dollars. But I've never seen him as happy as he was in these past 6 months. The man who left us 2 years ago was hollow, exhausted, distrustful of everyone around him. The man I found in this village was at peace for the first time in his adult life." "You did that, Elena." Elena listened as James described Marcus's life before San Miguel, the constant security threats, the kidnapping attempt that had traumatized his brother, the 3 failed engagements to women who'd turned out to be interested only in his wealth, the isolation of being unable to trust anyone's motives. "He's not perfect," James admitted. "The deception was wrong, and I told him so from the beginning. But please understand, it didn't come from a place of malice. It came from desperation. He was trying to answer a fundamental question. Was he capable of being loved for himself, or had his wealth permanently separated him from genuine human connection?" James stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, he's been miserable since you left. He's sitting in that shack, refusing to return to his real life until he speaks with you. Yesterday, the company's lawyers called. There are contracts worth billions waiting for his signature. He told them all to wait. You're more important to him than any of that." That evening, Elena walked back to the shack as the sun set. She found Marcus sitting on the sand outside, still wearing his beggar's clothes, staring at the waves. He looked up when her shadow fell across him, and she saw hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I've been thinking," Elena said slowly, sitting down beside him, "about what bothers me most. It's not the money, I never cared about that. It's not even the lie, although that hurt. It's that you didn't trust me. You said you fell in love with me, but love requires trust, Marcus. Real trust. And you couldn't tell me the truth even after we were married." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're right. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting what we had, but really, I was protecting myself from potential rejection. I'm sorry, Elena. Truly sorry." Elena was quiet for a long moment, listening to the waves crash against the shore. Finally, she spoke. "I fell in love with a man who was kind, intelligent, and strong despite having nothing. Now I need to figure out if that man is real, or if he was just a character you played. I need time, Marcus. Time to understand who you really are when you're not pretending to be poor and not hiding behind your billions. I need to know the real Marcus Steele, not the beggar and not the CEO, but whoever exists beneath both those masks." She stood up and looked down at him. "I'm not saying our marriage is over, but I'm not saying it's okay either. I'm saying I need time and honesty. Complete honesty. Can you give me that?" Marcus stood, and for the first time in days, a genuine smile crossed his face. Yes, he said simply. I can give you that. And I'll start right now. I'm terrified I've lost you, Elena. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and if I've destroyed that with my deception, I'll never forgive myself. That's the truth. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of leaving San Miguel to return to his corporate life, he announced he would be staying in the village indefinitely and that Steel Enterprises would be opening a regional office there. Within a week, construction crews arrived, having been flown in on chartered flights. The abandoned cannery on the edge of town, a building that had stood empty for 15 years, was purchased and began a rapid renovation. Marcus supervised the work personally, and villagers watched in amazement as the derelict structure transformed into a modern office building complete with satellite internet and state-of-the-art technology. But Marcus's transformation of San Miguel went deeper than just buildings. He announced a series of initiatives that would fundamentally change the village. First, a modern medical clinic would be built and staffed with 2 full-time doctors and 3 nurses, providing free healthcare to all residents. Second, the village school, which had been operating with outdated textbooks and a leaking roof, would be completely rebuilt and equipped with computers and a library. Third, he would fund scholarships for any village student who wanted to attend university. And fourth, he would invest in the local fishing industry, providing modern boats and equipment to the fishermen in exchange for fair trade agreements that would give them better prices for their catch. The villagers' reactions were mixed. Many were thrilled, suddenly singing Marcus's praises and conveniently forgetting their previous cruelty. But their transparent opportunism disgusted Elena, who watched as people who had mocked her marriage now competed for Marcus's attention and favor. Mrs. Fuentes, who had spat at her on her wedding day, now appeared at the construction site daily with homemade meals for Marcus, simpering about how she'd always known he was special. Mr. Santos cornered him repeatedly with business proposals, each more transparently self-serving than the last. Ricardo Gonzalez, who had called Elena an idiot for refusing him, now claimed they'd always been good friends and suggested a partnership in his family's fishing business. Marcus handled these overtures with cold politeness, accepting nothing from those who had shown cruelty. Instead, he focused his personal attention on those who had shown kindness during his time as a beggar. Old Thomas, his vagrant friend, was offered a position as a community liaison, a role that allowed him to help other homeless individuals while earning a living wage. Young Maria, who had shared her lunch, received a full scholarship to the university of her choice. Father Miguel found his church's long-neglected repairs fully funded. Marcus's message was clear. He valued character over opportunism, and past behavior had consequences. Meanwhile, Marcus's relationship with Elena remained complicated. They met daily for lunch, sitting on the beach as they had during their courtship, but now the conversations were different. Marcus spoke honestly about his life, holding nothing back. He told her about the loneliness of extraordinary wealth, about lovers who saw him as a bank account, about the constant paranoia of not knowing who to trust. He showed her the scars on his brother's wrists from the kidnapping ordeal, explaining how that trauma had nearly destroyed their family. He shared his fears about returning to that world, admitting that part of him wanted to stay in San Miguel forever, living simply despite his billions. But that's not realistic, he acknowledged. I have responsibilities, thousands of employees depending on the company's success, contracts to fulfill, shareholders to answer to. I can't hide forever. Elena listened, learning about a life so far removed from her own experience it might as well have been from another planet. Gradually, she began to see that the man she'd fallen in love with was real, but he was only one facet of a much more complex person. The question was whether she could love all of Marcus Steele, not just the parts he'd shown her as a beggar, and whether she could build a life in his world without losing herself in the process. As Marcus's transformation of San Miguel continued, the village split into factions. On one side were the opportunists, those who had treated Marcus and Elena with contempt but now sought to profit from his wealth. Led by Mr. Santos and other prominent families, they formed what they called the Economic Development Council, proposing schemes to extract maximum benefit from Marcus's presence. They suggested he build a luxury resort, invest in their businesses, even rename the village Steel Bay to attract tourism. Their meetings were characterized by transparent greed and shameless self-promotion, each member competing to ingratiate themselves with the billionaire in their midst. On the other side were those whom Elena privately called the honest poor, people who had shown kindness during the difficult months and who now approached Marcus's generosity with genuine gratitude rather than entitlement. Led by Father Miguel and including families like young Maria's, they formed a community group focused on sustainable development that would benefit everyone, not just the wealthy few. They proposed cooperative businesses, adult education programs, and infrastructure improvements that would create opportunities rather than handouts. Their approach impressed both Marcus and Elena, who began spending more time with this group, planning initiatives that would genuinely improve village life. But there was a third faction, smaller and more bitter, those who resented Marcus entirely. Led by Ricardo Gonzalez, who had never forgiven Elena for rejecting him, they muttered that Marcus was destroying the village's traditional way of life, that his money was corrupting everyone, that things had been better before he'd revealed his wealth. "We were a real community before," Ricardo complained loudly at the cantina. "Now we're just beggars waiting for handouts from King Marcus. He makes us all feel small." This group refused Marcus's help on principle, turning down scholarships and medical care, clinging to their pride even as their children suffered from lack of opportunity and their elderly parents went without proper health care. The tension came to a head at a village meeting called to discuss Marcus's proposals. The town hall was packed, with people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorways. Mr. Santos stood at the front, holding court, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "Our friend Marcus, may I call you friend, Marcus, has blessed our village with his presence and generosity. I propose we show our appreciation by naming him honorary mayor and—" He was interrupted by Ricardo, who stood up angrily. "I propose we tell him to leave. We don't need his charity. Our village survived for 200 years without a billionaire pulling strings. We're not puppets for him to control." The room erupted in argument, voices raised in anger on all sides. Mr. Santos's faction shouted down Ricardo, calling him ungrateful and foolish. Ricardo's supporters responded that the others had sold their dignity for money. The honest poor tried to mediate, suggesting compromise and careful planning. Through it all, Marcus sat quietly beside Elena, his expression unreadable. Finally, Father Miguel stood up, and the room gradually quieted out of respect for the elderly priest. "We're tearing ourselves apart," he said sadly. "And for what? Because a man chose to live among us, fell in love with one of our daughters, and now wants to help us? Because some of us treated him badly when we thought he was poor, and now we're ashamed? Because others are proud and can't accept help even when it's freely given?" Father Miguel turned to face Marcus directly. "You came here seeking something real, seeking to be loved for who you are rather than what you have. But your wealth follows you like a shadow, Marcus. It changes everything it touches. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You can't save us from ourselves. We have to decide who we want to be, a village that judges people by their character or their bank accounts, a community that helps each other or tears each other apart, a place where your children would want to live or one they'd flee at the first opportunity." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the priest's words. Elena looked at her husband and saw him truly struggling with these questions for the first time, recognizing that his wealth was indeed a shadow that could darken everything around him if not handled with wisdom and care. The fairy tale of the secret billionaire was proving far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and the village of San Miguel stood at a crossroads that would define its future and test every person's true character. 3 months after Marcus's identity was revealed, Elena found herself on a private jet for the first time in her life, flying to Geneva, where Steel Enterprises was headquartered. Marcus had business that couldn't be postponed any longer, and he'd asked, almost begged, for her to come with him. "I want you to see my world," he'd said. "All of it. The good and the bad. Then you can make an informed decision about whether you want to be part of it." Elena had agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because she knew their relationship couldn't move forward until she understood the full scope of what being married to Marcus Steele actually meant. The jet was beyond luxurious, with leather seats that reclined into beds, a full galley where a private chef prepared meals, and a conference room where Marcus worked during the flight. Elena sat by the window, watching clouds pass below, trying to process this new reality. James Crawford sat across from her, working on his laptop, but occasionally looking up to gauge her reaction. "Overwhelming?" he asked kindly. Elena nodded. "This plane probably costs more than everyone in San Miguel will earn in their entire lives combined." James smiled slightly. "Actually, it's one of 3. And you're not wrong about the cost. But try not to think of it in those terms. For Marcus, this is just a tool that lets him work efficiently while traveling. He doesn't think about the cost any more than you think about the cost of a pencil." In Geneva, Elena's education in wealth continued. Marcus's primary residence was a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Geneva. The art on the walls included original Picassos and Monets. The bathroom was larger than her parents' entire house. Staff members, a housekeeper, a chef, a personal assistant, greeted Marcus respectfully and Elena with warm curiosity. "Sir, it's wonderful to have you home," said Catherine, the housekeeper who had worked for Marcus for a decade. "And Mrs. Steele, welcome. We've prepared the master suite for you both." Elena noticed that Catherine's greeting was genuinely warm, without the calculating opportunism she'd seen in San Miguel. The next day, Elena accompanied Marcus to Steele Enterprises headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in Geneva's business district. As they entered, employees greeted Marcus with respect that seemed genuine rather than fearful. In the elevator to the executive floor, Marcus explained, "I try to run the company differently than most. Better wages, better benefits, better work-life balance. It costs more, but loyalty and productivity are worth it." On the executive floor, Elena sat in on meetings where Marcus negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, his intelligence and strategic thinking on full display. She saw a different side of her husband, confident, commanding, brilliant in ways that were invisible when loading fish crates in San Miguel. But she also saw the pressures. Security personnel followed them everywhere, a necessity after the kidnapping attempt on Marcus's brother. His phone rang constantly with urgent matters. During a lunch break, 3 different people approached with crisis situations requiring immediate decisions. Elena watched as Marcus handled each one with patience and wisdom, but she could see the strain it put on him. "This is why I needed to escape," he told her that evening as they sat on the penthouse balcony, looking out at the city lights. "This life is successful, yes. I've built something important, employed thousands of people, created technologies that make the world safer. But it's relentless, Elena. There's no peace, no privacy, no moment when I can just be Marcus rather than Marcus Steele, CEO and billionaire." Over dinner, Marcus made a proposal. "I've been thinking about how to make this work. Our marriage, my responsibilities, your happiness. All of it. Here's what I want to suggest. We keep the house in San Miguel as our primary residence. I can work remotely most of the time, with James handling day-to-day operations here in Geneva. I'll need to travel occasionally for crucial meetings, and I'd like you to come with." Continue. 3:30 p.m. "Me when you're willing. We can live simply most of the time, but we'll use the resources we have to do good, the medical clinic, the schools, the scholarships. We'll build a life that's real and meaningful, but we'll do it with the advantage of not having to worry about money." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't need the penthouses and private jets to be happy, Elena. I never did. What I need is you, and a life that feels authentic. Can we build that together?" Elena looked at her husband, this complicated man who was somehow both the humble beggar she'd fallen in love with and the powerful billionaire she was still learning to know, and for the first time since the revelation, she felt hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this impossible situation work after all. 6 months after Marcus's identity was revealed, San Miguel had transformed. The new medical clinic was operating at full capacity, providing care that had saved lives, including Elena's mother, who was successfully treated for a heart condition that would have killed her without intervention. The school was a model for the region, with students from neighboring villages applying for admission. The fishing cooperative Marcus had funded was thriving, giving local fishermen fair prices and sustainable practices. Infrastructure improvements, paved roads, reliable electricity, clean water, had raised everyone's quality of life. The village's population was growing as young people who had left for the cities began returning, seeing opportunity where there had been only stagnation. But perhaps more importantly, the village had learned something about character. The opportunists who had treated Marcus with cruelty when he was poor and then fawned over him once his wealth was revealed found themselves increasingly isolated. The community had quietly rejected their values, recognizing that Mr. Santos's constant scheming and Mrs. Fuentes's transparent hypocrisy were traits to be avoided rather than emulated. The honest poor, meanwhile, had become community leaders, running the cooperative businesses and educational programs with integrity and wisdom. Even Ricardo Gonzalez's bitter faction had mostly dissolved, as people realized that pride was a poor substitute for their children's education and their parent health care. On a warm evening in late summer, the village held a celebration, not for Marcus or his money, but for the community they were building together. The square was decorated with lights, and families gathered to share food and music. Elena stood beside her husband, watching children play games that Father Miguel had organized. Old Thomas, now clean-shaven and wearing the simple dignity of a man with purpose, was helping serve food. Young Maria was home from her first semester at university, glowing with excitement as she told younger children about her studies. The scene was joyful, but it wasn't the shallow joy of sudden wealth. It was the deeper satisfaction of a community that had faced its worst impulses and chosen to be better. Marcus squeezed Elena's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've made a final decision about the company. I'm stepping down as CEO. James will take over day-to-day operations. I'll remain as chairman, which means I'll still guide major decisions and attend important meetings, but I won't be consumed by the business anymore. Life is too short, Elena. I spent too many years chasing success and missing what mattered. I don't want to waste any more time." Elena looked at him in surprise. Steel Enterprises was his life's work, the company he'd built from nothing. "Are you sure?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "I'm sure. The company will be fine, better than fine. It's time for new leadership. And it's time for me to live differently." Later that night, they walked along the beach to their home. No longer the shack, but a modest house Marcus had built, comfortable but not ostentatious, a compromise between his wealth and their desire for normalcy. Elena's copper wire engagement ring had been replaced with a simple gold band, but she kept the copper ring in a box by their bed, a reminder of where they'd started. As they sat on their porch watching the moonlight on the water, Elena thought about the extraordinary journey they'd taken, from mocked couple to village benefactors, from deception to honesty, from two separate worlds to a shared life that honored both their values. "I've been thinking," Elena said, "about what I learned from all this. When I married you, I thought I was choosing love over security, character over wealth. I was proud of myself for seeing beyond your poverty to your worth. But I was still judging you, just in a different way. I put you in a box labeled poor but noble, which was just as limiting as the village's box labeled worthless beggar. The real lesson wasn't about poverty or wealth. It was about seeing people completely, in all their complexity, without reducing them to a single dimension." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "And I learned that I can't run from who I am. My wealth is part of me, whether I like it or not. The question isn't how to escape it, but how to use it well, how to let it be a tool for good rather than a barrier to connection. You taught me that, Elena. You loved me when I was pretending to be poor, yes, but you also challenged me to be honest about who I really am. That's a harder gift to accept than love, but it's the one I needed most." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had tested each other in the strangest ways and emerged with something solid and true. The village slept around them, transformed not just by one man's wealth, but by the collective choice to value character over appearances, generosity over greed, authenticity over performance. In the morning, there would be work to do, businesses to run, programs to manage, lives to build. But tonight, there was just this. The sound of waves, the warmth of summer air, the quiet certainty of two people who had found something real in a world that often valued everything but reality. The beggar and the village girl, the billionaire and the seamstress, Marcus and Elena. All their identities folded together into something neither simple nor easy, but honest and worthwhile. And in the end, that was more valuable than all the billions in the world.